Hello and welcome to A Push. Today we're going to take a short foray away or take a short journey away from American history to briefly discuss the history of the Great War. I know you all paid very close attention in your world history classes, so for a lot of you this is going to be completely review, but I just want to lay out the basic course of the war before US entry, so by the time the United States shows up, you have some sense of what was already happening and the sort of forces that were already governing the conflict. So let's dive in. Hopefully, by the end of this, you'll be able to complete these objectives, so pause and copy them down if you need to. And we'll dive in to tell the story of the Great War in a very, very sort of broad sense. Okay. World War I, of course, had a series of causes, and it's very difficult to point to any one country as having actually created it. Hopefully, you remember the whole mania thing, or animal, or whatever acronym you have. You know, your militarism, your alliances system, your nationalism, your imperialism, and the assassination. So, pointing to any one cause is difficult because, of course, there are a lot of causes. But in the end, the combination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand getting assassinated, Russia mobilizing, and then the Schlieffen Plan leading to Germany attacking Belgium is some combination of that caused the war. This was problematic, of course, both because Belgium was a theoretically neutral country, the Germans committed some atrocities in Belgium, plus the Treaty of London in 1830, when Belgium was created as a country, basically demanded or stipulated that Belgium stay neutral, and Belgium's treaty or territory not be infringed upon. And so when Germany invaded Belgium, this brought England into the war, finalizing the sort of the allied powers of Great Britain, France, and Russia, and a bunch of countries you don't need to care about, and the central powers of Germany, and then a bunch of countries you don't need to care about. Sorry, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Beginning of the war was the Battle of the Frontiers, because the Belgians more or less get crushed. And so the German army meets the French and British army at the Battle of the Frontiers. At this battle, what they basically discover is that, man, no one knows how to fight a war, but the Germans are slightly better at it than everyone else, because the German artillery just destroys the French artillery. The French had gone with this stupid plan of, well, I shouldn't call it stupid because, of course, they hadn't tested it yet, but they tried to go with much smaller, shorter ranged artillery. And it turns out that the Germans could just blow the French apart from way too far away. And so the Allies were crushed in this first battle, and the Great Retreat happens. So the Allies were pushed back across most of France, but as the German army approaches and moves by Paris to eventually capture it and end the war, the French army finally sort of stiffens up, and they fight this brutal battle called the Battle of the Marne. The French general Joseph Joffre maintains his calm in between his fabulous and many lunches, and stops the German army at the Marne, and so the war is not lost within the first 6 months of fighting. So the German army turned back at the Marne. Here's Joseph Joffre, and hopefully my joke about lunches now makes much more sense. Then the German army is pushed back as both sides try to find a flank. This is the quote unquote race to the sea. The German army digs in along the Aisne River and starts building fortifications, our first trenches of World War I. And eventually both armies meet at the Battle of Ypres. At the Battle of Ypres, we get all of the things that we generally associate with World War I. We get the poison gas, we get the machine guns, we get the trenches, we get all this horrific stuff. And it turns into a brutal slog and a battle of attrition where both sides are just basically trying to kill as many soldiers as they can, because it starts to become clear that an actual breakthrough is not going to happen. This then breaks it down into a stalemate, with trenches spanning basically the entire border between France and Germany. We get the reserve trenches, and then we get the reserve trenches, and then we get the long-range artillery, and basically attacking into any of this stuff is suicide. The British, of course, blockade the Germans. The Germans start using submarines to blockade the British, and everyone tries to starve the other side out while launching massive human wave attacks that kill hundreds of thousands of people and gain basically no territory. So that sounds fun. In the end, in order to try to starve the sides out, everyone tries to come up with ways to get around all of these blockades. The Germans build a massive gun that can fire more or less from the front lines to Paris and start shelling Paris. This is your Paris gun here. The British try to break the blockade and help out Russia by launching an invasion of the Ottoman Empire that turns into, again, a bloody stalemate where no one wins and no one's happy. And both the British and the Germans launch massive attacks to try to kill as many of the other soldiers as possible. At the Battle of the Somme, the British suffer their horrific defeat, launching huge attacks into the German Hindenburg line and suffering huge casualties. At Verdun, the Germans and the French kill each other in huge numbers. Both of these battles lasted for months, and the casualties start to rise up into the millions. So that's pretty problematic and obviously not sustainable long term. On the Eastern Front, things go much better for the Germans. The whole plan, of course, was to originally knock France out immediately, but it becomes clear that that's not possible. So, with the brilliant German general Erich Ludendorff developing this defense in depth strategy, where you basically you give up a small amount of territory. It's basically zone defense. You spread everything out, and then when they attack, you have people converge in and force them to pay an incredibly high price as they push in. So, with that in place, Hindenburg and Ludendorff go to the Eastern Front, where they win stunning battles against the Russians, most famously at the Battle of Tannenberg. So the Russian army, or two separate Russian armies, gets surrounded and destroyed by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, and the Eastern Front in Russia starts to collapse because of a combination of Russian unpreparedness and the antiquated and inefficient system run by Tsar Nicholas II, which again, hopefully you remember from our world history class. The Tsar is then overthrown in our whole March or February Revolution, depending on which calendar you're looking at. And there's a provisional government set up in Russia under Alexander Kerensky. And they try to stay in the war because basically the only thing keeping Russia afloat at this point is aid from the Allies. And so Russia launches a massive offensive that ends up killing a bunch of soldiers and leading to massive mutinies of Russian troops. This then leads to the overthrow of the Russian provisional government, as Vladimir Lenin is put in a closed train car by Ludendorff and sent to destroy the Russian Empire, which he then does. In the October Revolution, Russia drops out of the war, signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. I don't speak Russian. You can see it there. And where they give up tons of territory in exchange for getting out of the war. And so where we're going to leave our story is now Germany only has one front to fight on, and they're going to turn and attempt to bring the hammer down on Britain and France. France at this point is really struggling. The guy who's put in charge of the French army is named Nivelle, and he launches, oh, that's spelled incorrectly. Oh, well, I'm not going to fix it. It doesn't matter. He tries to launch a massive assault, and the French army starts to mutiny. And so it's becoming clear that the Allies are starting to break under the pressure, but it should be noted that this is also the time of the horrific turnip winter in Germany, where the German people are starving because of a lack of resources. So you've got Russia collapsing into revolution, French soldiers mutinying and refusing to fight, and the German people literally starving. And so the basic question is who can outlast who, and will the massive German offensive be enough to break the French before the German people finally starve to death? So that's where we'll leave our story. Hopefully you can adequately answer these questions. And when we come back, we'll return to the presidency of Woodrow Wilson and attempt to talk our way through how the United States is dealing with this global catastrophe.